Hi, welcome. I'm delighted that you're able to join Emily and I this morning for the program that we're going to do called Ins and Outs of Joint Tenancy. And your co-host there, Emily, is my what I call my tech buddy, because she's the one that knows how to do things. And every time I try to do something different to be challenging to her, and she's usually able to figure it out. Our topic today is something that I include in my programs when I'm presenting those across the state of Montana, because that is a very popular way of holding property. And as you indicate the towns that you're from, I think next time what we'll do is just sort of indicate on the map that we have and add a few stars to show you where some of the people that are watching from. So welcome across Montana. We're delighted to have you. And then rumor has it that there's some of those out-of-staters that are tuning in today. I've shared this with some of my colleagues from other states and even a few relatives, getting them to tune in if they can. And if the Kansas 4-H Foundation is out there, I say welcome, and we're delighted to have you as well. So first of all, how do you know if you have property? And that property can be your checking account, savings account. It can be your real property. How do you know if it's in joint tenancy? You take a look at the deed or the signature card that you have, and you see if it says John Doe and Mary Doe as joint tenants with right of survivorship and not as tenants in common. What you've got is a joint tenancy. Now, why do we do joint tenancies? Well, it's easy. And a lot of people think, well, when you get married, that's what you should put your property in. Share and share alike. Okay, so as you know, Emily mentioned tools, and one of those is a practice poll question. So, what property do you own in joint tenancy with right of survivorship with someone else? So
Marsha,
I'm sorry?
your stuff isn't showing up on the screen. I'm not sure why. We see you right now. I'll open the poll, though, for people to answer.
Okay, sorry. Need to let me know these things earlier so I don't keep ranting and raving.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were still on introduction stuff a little bit.
Okay, do you see that poll at all?
The poll is up, yes, and people are answering, but I don't see your screen.
All right, well, let's just start me over. I had this weird black screen show up, and I wondered about that. Okay. Now, can you see the audience enhancement tool? Oh, great. And I am as presenter, correct?
Yes, yep, I have you as presenter.
Okay, I got out of PowerPoint. So, hold on.
It's okay. People are still answering the poll question.
Okay.
There, now I can see your computer screen.
Oh. We'll try this again. Now, do we have it?
Yes. Yep, you're up now.
Oh, good.
Sorry,
Good.
I thought you were still on introduction, so I would have said so.
I wondered why my photograph wasn't showing up, so now. Okay, is everybody there? My apologies. So, do we have some results that you can share with us, Emily, on what kind of property people are holding in joint tenancy?
Yeah, we do. So make sure when you submit a poll that you hit submit at the bottom too. Just a reminder for folks, it doesn't always tell you that. There we go.
Oh, right. It looks like we have a few that don't have anything that's held in joint tenancy, but we've got, let's see, those percentages. 47% have checking and savings, 24 with stocks, bonds, and mutual funds, and real property is 47%. So I just saw a quick thing flash up on the screen that asked about, is a POD the same as a joint tenancy? No, if you have a joint tenancy, it's going to say that. And then what a POD is a payable on death designation. So the POD happens to be the beneficiary that you want to receive it upon your death. And we have a recorded seminar about that if you haven't had a chance to watch. The other thing I'm doing with my program is to sort of use wildflowers. I enjoy those because they help, I think, make the program a little bit more interesting, and I use them as triggers. And I think you'll see why when I use some of the names. But these triggers are designed to help you remember some of the consequences of joint tenancy property. Now, I'm not saying that joint tenancy is bad. It's very handy. It avoids probate. There's some very good benefits to it. But we also need to be aware there may be some consequences there that we didn't even think about. Now, the pine drop, yep, I really saw a pine drop that looks exactly like a question mark. And this pine drop is to have you write your questions in the chat panel, and it's a reminder to me to tell you to do that. So feel free to ask your questions, because what we're going to do is remain in the webinar room for another 30 minutes after we finish today so that we can get your specific questions answered. Now, this is a steer's head. And I can just see that's why it's called that. Don't you see the eyes, the ears? And what it tells me is I want to steer you to an awareness of some of the advantages and disadvantages of joint tenancy property. Okay? Now, this is a prickly poppy that we happen to have found in Utah. And what it makes me think about how you title your real and personal property can be a little prickly, or maybe the result can be prickly. So let's take a look at this. I know that a lot of you have your property as joint tenants with right of survivorship. So we kind of know that. But I would like for you to indicate, how is the majority of your property owned? Is it in sole ownership? Is it in joint tenancy with right of survivorship? Is it a tenant in common? Do you have your property in a trust? And then we've got business arrangements, LLCs, S&C corporations, and partnerships and limited liability partnerships. So just think about all the property that you own and say, okay, how do I have the majority of this property titled? And then you will click one of those. And while you're doing that, I'll explain that in a lot of the programs that I do, I don't really get into the LLCs and those business arrangement type things, because anybody that's gone to that method of a business arrangement, what you've done is already contact an attorney. But the rest of us with our houses and our checking accounts, we don't necessarily go to an attorney before we do that. So what have we got? Don't forget, hit that submit button. What have we got as some responses? And let's just see how popular joint tenancy is with our audience today. Okay, so not a bit surprising to me is that I find joint tenancy is the most popular. It's 36% of you, and then we have 21% that have sole ownership. And look at that, we do have a few people that have a tenancy in common. And I've actually done meetings where I ask that question, and nobody holds their property as a tenant in common. So let's move on and take a look then about that. See, in Montana specifically, it is joint tenancy, then sole ownership, and then tenancy in common. So let's just do an easy one. We've got $800,000 in joint tenancy between the husband and wife. And what we see is the husband has passed away because he has the black box. That's what it means. And then we've got his mom and his dad living, and we have the wife. And I said the property is in joint tenancy. So this is one that you can think about and even say it out loud, because there's nobody around to hear you. But I bet a lot of you will say, why, sure. Joint tenancy, that's exactly what it means. Is when one person dies, the survivor takes all. And that's correct. But now let's change that property to a tenancy in common between the husband and wife. And now we want to know how much of that $800,000 in total will the wife receive? So that's my poll question. How much of that 800,000 will the wife receive? 800,000, 750,000, 650, or 400,000. So, Emily, when you can get that poll up there, we'll find this out. Emily, are you there? Ah, she is. Okay, how much will the wife receive? 800,000, 750, 650, or 400,000? Okay, what do we got there? All right, we've got 52% that are saying 400,000. That's interesting. We've got 16% that said 800,000. So we can see that you're not necessarily in an agreement here. So that means we've got to figure out what the right answer is and why is it the amount that it is. So let's first take a look at what is a tenancy in common. It's another way that we can title property when we have more than one individual. You can have 2, 3, 4, even more than that. And what we have with the tenancy in common is each owns an undivided interest in that property. It means if we have some land out there, we don't draw a line down the center of the land and say, well, this person owns the right side and the other person owns the left side. It's an undivided interest. So if we look at this situation that I was giving you, we've got the tenancy in common, which means the husband owns 400,000 or 1/2 as far as a fraction, and the wife owns half of that as well. So we've got 400,000. So we've still got the husband dying. And what happens is that we have a law in Montana under the Uniform Probate Code that says the surviving spouse receives the first 300,000 and 3/4 of the balance, but 1/4 ends up going to the parents. So in this case, it means that the wife is only going to receive 675,000. Let's just say that was money. That's what she gets. And his mom and dad are going to receive 62,500 each. Now, you see, what the husband can do is write a will if he wanted to and be able to leave that to his spouse. So you see, how you have your property titled has a big impact on the dollar amount that your heirs are going to receive. So in this case, we can see that the surviving spouse could receive 800,000 if it's joint tenancy with right of survivorship, but only 675,000 if the property is held as a tenant in common. Now, if he does write a will, chances are what the husband would want to do is provide for his wife and say, yeah, mom and dad are fine. What he's going to do is leave everything to the spouse. On the other hand, he might decide that what he's going to do is leave some property to his son. So that means the son then would have an undivided interest, 1/2, with the wife up there, which may be his stepmom, or it could be his biological mother. But it's just something to think about there. So that's my reflection from the prickly poppy is I want you to really know, how do you have your property titled? When I'm out in the communities, I have people say, well, what if I looked at mine and it only says John Doe and Mary Doe? What do I have? Well, Montana law will assume that you have a tenancy in common and not a joint tenancy. So that's one of the questions your attorney is going to ask you when you're doing some estate planning and writing a will is, how do you have your property titled? And you need to know that and, quite frankly, be able to prove it. Now, if you take a look at these beautiful flowers, I just think they're lovely. They are called a white mule's ear. Now, why would I pick out mule's ear? Well, have you heard the phrase, dad or mom is stubborn as a mule? I bet you have. Well, what I want to do is quickly examine the consequences of dad being stubborn as a mule. Now, here's the dad. His wife died 6 years ago. and he's got 2 children. They're adult children, and the year is 2001. So what Dad has done is leave the property in his name only, because he's saying, hey, if I die, the state of Montana is going to give the property half and half. So why would I write a will and pay that expense when it's the same as what the state would do? Well, let's take a look. The concern of the kids. What if Dad marries that wow floozy from Billings? Uh-huh. And that's the phone call I got from one of the pink children, A or B. They are concerned because what Dad did was remarry in the year 2010. And the first thing he did was put that property in joint tenancy with his new wife. Okay, so the kids are wanting me to call up Dad and say, hi there. By the way, do you know consequences of joint tenancy? But I can't do that as a state employee. But you see, Dad is no fool. He has told his kids, look, I have written a will, and that will was written after the joint tenancy was formed. So therefore, you're going to get the ranch and she is going to get the house. Okay, Dad the mule dies. Will Dad's kids get the ranch because his will was written after the joint tenancy was formed? What I want you to do is type quickly yes or no in the chat room. We want to know if Dad's kids are going to get the will or get the ranch because the will was written after the joint tenancy was formed. So quickly write your answer in the chat room. I want to provide you with a little bit of opportunity to do something different there. So if you haven't taken advantage of that chat room, don't forget to try it out. Okay, Emily, you're the one that's in charge of watching those chats. What seems to be coming up the most?
We've got a couple yeses, mostly no's. Yeah, mostly no's, 3 or 4 yeses coming through.
Okay, now see, if we had a live audience here, I'd be asking you people that say yes, why you're saying that. And I bet your response would be, well, the will was written after the joint tenancy. And the answer is a big no. No, the kids aren't going to get it because it's all in joint tenancy with right of survivorship. So with the death of the dad, it all goes to his wife. She receives all. He has unintentionally disinherited his children because he's stubborn as a mule and thinks that his will is going to override that joint tenancy. And that's not the worst of the news. Let's say that the new wife dies with all of that property. Now who inherits the property? Oh, you've probably figured it out, haven't you? Her kids now receive all that property. His kids, once again, has been disinherited because of that joint tenancy. Not at all what he wanted to have happen. And you can imagine what his 2 kids think. And I've had some, when I've given that example, say, boy, I would sue. And I'm afraid I would say, good luck, because it's not going to happen. It's joint tenancy. It's property law contract. Now, let's take another example and say that Mom didn't die. What she did was marry the hunk that lives in Missoula. Okay, so she did. She remarried. But guess what she did? She put the property in joint tenancy with her new husband. Then she died. Who receives the property at that point in time? Oh, you bet. It's the new husband. So in this case, there are severe consequences of joint tenancy without knowing it. He's disinherited his kids. She wound up disinheriting her kids because of that misunderstanding about a will overriding. So joint tenancy with right of survivorship may not be the best choice if you want to provide for your children from a prior marriage. Okay, that's the reflection from the white mule's ear. Now let's take a look at some pink monkey flowers. And what they make me think about is joint tenancies with married couples. And what I'm going to ask Emily to do is tell us what are the consequences of joint tenancy for a young couple that's married and they don't have children. Do you click or do I?
You'll have to click, Marsha.
Okay.
So, for example, we have Tim and Sharon. They've got a property, their house in joint tenancy, but they've got no children and no will because why would they, right? They don't have any kids to pass anything on to. But let's look at this scenario. So let's say they get in a really unfortunate accident and Tim dies first. Sharon survives, but she's in the hospital and she ends up passing away on the third day. So the question is, who receives the property if Tim dies first on the first day and Sharon dies just 3 days after him and they don't have any will? There's a poll question. Just remember to hit submit. You're not being graded, so go ahead and take a guess. So does it go to Tim's parents, Sharon's parents, half to each, or does it go to the state of Montana because they didn't have a will? Okay, it looks like we've got most of our answers in. Okay. So we've
looks like to me they're saying Sharon's parents.
Yep, that's what I'm seeing too. 50% said Sharon's parents, 9%.
Why do you think they're saying that? I'm sorry.
Probably because, I mean, it seems intuitive because Sharon was the one who passed away second, but there's an interesting rule that we have to take a look at.
That's true, because if you were in Kansas, you would be right, but you're not. You're Montana law.
Yep, so we had 14% of people that got this one right. Half of it goes to Tim's parents and half of it goes to Sharon's parents. And this has to do with the amount of time between when Tim passed away and when Sharon passed away. So if neither joint tenant survives the other by 120 hours, then the property is split equally among their heirs. So in Montana, if two joint tenants die within 120 hours of each other, they consider it as if they had passed away at the same time.
Yeah, I often get asked why this law exists, and all I can say is that's what the legislature did when they passed the Uniform Probate Code.
So let's look at scenario 2 and say that Sharon lives beyond 120 hours and she doesn't pass away until the 6th day after the accident. If that happens, then that 50% would be right, that it would all go to Sharon's parents because she lived longer than 120 hours after her husband. So, scenario 3, let's say Sharon is the one who passes away the day of the accident, and Tim survives another 6 days, so he lives beyond the 120 hours. You can probably guess what the answer is here. All of it would go to Tim's parents. So that 120-hour rule is a big deal with joint tenancy. So this is something I consider myself because my husband and I don't have kids right now, but we do have some property in joint tenancy. So just keeping in mind that there are different scenarios, different options, depending on what might happen. So it could all go to Tim's parents or all to Sharon's parents or half to each, just depending again on that 120-hour rule. So just keep that in mind. Even if you think maybe having a will or having some other kind of beneficiary plan isn't important because you don't have kids and it doesn't matter, I don't have anything to pass on anyways, just be aware of the 120-hour survival requirement for joint tenancy property because otherwise it might be distributed in a way you wouldn't expect.
Yeah, and Emily, I'm kind of maybe betting that you thought, well, we've got our property in joint tenancy, we don't need to plan. And you still need a will because it could wind up going to your folks or Logan's folks. And what you want is to have what happens if. So if both of you, oh, this is awful, but both of you were killed in a car accident, okay?
Yeah.
Then your will would come into play when both of you are gone, and then you could decide to distribute however you want to. But that's why we want to do a will. Now, another one I want to take a look at is joint tenancy between parents and children. I get this a lot in my meetings as well. And what I've got here is Sarah with an $80,000 in her checking account, and she's done that with her daughter, Susan. She has two other daughters, Carrie and Jane. Well, what Sarah's done is not think through this. You see, I've heard of people doing this, and if I could jump in the conversation, I'd say, what if Susan divorces? What we've got is mom's 80,000 subject to that divorce settlement. What if Susan gets sued as a result of an accident? Well, they can go after mom's $80,000. What if Susan becomes dependent on drugs? Well, gee, she could end up using mom's money to support her habit. And what about creditors? If Susan has creditors, that joint tenancy property is subject to creditor claims. So if I could have visited with her, I'd have said, let's think through those consequences before you do this. So Sarah is smart. She wrote a will, and she decided to divide that equally among her three daughters. Okay, how is that $80,000 divided? Okay, Emily's got that up there. I'm sure you all know the answer to this one because of what we've already learned. So make sure you hit an answer and press or click on submit. Okay, I'm going to rush you on this one a little bit, Emily. I'm watching the clock. What are most of our answers appearing? Okay, we've got equally among, okay, the people that are saying that are taking the will controls. Excuse me. So I'm going to show you the answer here. It all goes to Sarah because that is in joint tenancy with right of survivorship. Again, the will has no effect on this. So those of you with joint tenancy property need to know that. So what she's done is disinherit daughter Carrie and daughter Jane. And as I usually ask my audience, do you think Susan will share? And I usually get the groans and the head shakes saying no. So you see, joint tenancy with right of survivorship takes priority over a will, and it doesn't matter when the will was written. Now, Montana did step in and help in this situation because they passed a law that allows us what is called an agency designation. In other words, this person can still sign the checks and help out mom, but there's no ownership rights. So there's a form that we have in our Mott guides, and that form can help people take a look before you go to the institution, and you can say you want a multiple party account without survivorship. And in that case, then mom's will comes in, all three daughters share equally. So maybe other states have that as well. The publication that we have is called Non-Probate Transfers, and it provides examples of that Uniform Multiple Party Account Act. Well, here I am rushing through, but I wanted to make sure that we got some information out to you, and I've observing the time has slipped away quicker than I thought it would. I hope I did steer you towards some of the advantages and disadvantages of joint tenancies, because it's joint tenancy with right of survivorship. And if you don't have a memory like this beautiful elephant's head, well, we now have 44 different Mott guides in Montana that can help you on almost any estate planning topic. And don't forget, those Mott guides are available also from our county and reservation extension offices. Now, next week, we're going to get into wills. We're going to look at some decision making about equal versus equitable and answer questions that people have about those. And before some of you sign off that aren't interested in the questions, we want to thank you very much for being here today. And I promise that I will practice between now and next time to make sure I get the right screens up for all of you. So, Emily, shall we have them share some of their thoughts about the webinar with us?
Yeah,
And
I
then
can.
while we're doing that, you can ask some questions.
Yeah, so you should see a poll come up on the right side of your screen that will ask you some questions just for some feedback on the program. Make sure you scroll down because I think there's 5 questions and it might not show you all of them at once. The top question asks for your email address if you would like to be reminded of Tuesday Tips webinars. Make sure that you type your email address out for us if you would like those reminders. And again, that's not shared outside of our Tuesday Tips network, so you won't get any other emails aside from that one. For some questions while that poll is going. So one of them, let me find that first one. So somebody said, it interests me that the tenancy in common leaves 1/4 to the parents rather than to the children. Can you explain that? So I think that goes back to one of those first.
Okay, now if you will take a look at that example, I didn't have children because you're exactly right. If that couple would have had children, it would have gone to all of it to the spouse if those were the biological children. But I was purposely not showing the children in that case because I wanted individuals to realize that if they've got that property in this case, it was a tenant in common, that part of that is going to end up going to the folks. And we'd have a very similar situation, which is happening in Montana right now.
Do you know how mobile titles are typically defaulted when in 2 different names? Is that similar to a car title?
Mobile title, like a snowmobile.
I'm not sure. Or maybe.
Okay, I'll use the illustration that what we've got is Montana. And Montana passed a law that anytime we have vehicles, that if you have it in 2 names, it's automatically assumed that it's a joint tenancy and not as a tenant in common. It's kind of difficult to do that tenant in common with a car, just like it is with a house or with land. But that's what they decided. So if you've got any kind of vehicles, though, and they're in 2 names, for example, or 3 names, what we've got is joint tenancy with right of survivorship.
Okay. So then there's actually another question from a different person asking then, so is there a better or preferred way for spouses to hold title to their vehicles, campers, boats, etc.? Is there something that's preferred?
Yeah, it's not, number one, I can't give legal advice. But number two, it depends on what your objectives are. Are you wanting, like the vehicle to just be convenient for having that title in both names? Or do you want them separated out just in case one of you is involved in a business and you're afraid of maybe being sued? If so, that property that you have separately helps eliminate some of that concern. So in Montana, again, there is an option for that joint tenancy that it's very easy to transfer title from one to the other. It doesn't have to go through a court process to do that. And so one of the Mont guides that we've got is severing joint tenancies on real property. You see, when somebody dies, we do need to get that person's name removed from the document. Because if we don't do it when they've died, then we've got to go back after the second person dies. And I've got a friend right now that's paying over $5,000 in attorney fees to get that situation worked out for them.
Okay, so I guess on that note, you mentioned that we have that Mont guide about severing joint tenancy, but there's another question that came up about asking how difficult is it then to change the designation or to remove joint tenancy from real or personal property?
Yeah. See, the thing is with a joint checking account, one dies, then the survivor takes all. And in the past, we didn't even have to open up a new account. Well, now when that's done, because of the things that have happened in our society, we have to have, and typically the bank will require that when we end this bank account, then we'll start a new one. But typically there's no fees that are involved with that. And the same way, there's a special form that the Department of Motor Vehicles has for severing that joint tenancy with the vehicle. Now, when we get down to real property is a little more complicated, but it's not impossible, because what there is a special affidavit for ending the joint tenancy. And the Department of Public Health and Human Services has that available at their website. Not right now, but they have had it in the past, and what they're doing is updating that. So in the Mont Guide, we can describe the process, and then that's something that can be done without, having to pay an attorney to do it for you.
Okay. So then another question that came up, which is better on a checking account then, a multiple party account or a POD?
Okay, multiple party account. You see, you can have one of those with survivorship or without survivorship. Okay, how does that work? Well, with survivorship, you're saying that you wanted to go to these other individuals. And then the third stage would be perhaps a POD if all of those were deceased at the same time, then you could POD it to someone else. So I would suggest take a look at that multiple party account form that we have, because there's an agency designation that's different. The agency it's like a power of attorney. I grant Emily power to sign my checks, but upon my death, Emily can't sign any more checks. And that's okay, because it ceases at my death. And then I have somebody else appointed as personal representative to settle my estate when I'm gone.
Okay. Another question came up. Why would we want to use tenants in common? Because it just divides property up more and more. So what's the purpose of a tenancy in common? Are there any benefits to that?
Again, it gets into your objectives, because let's say that, for example, you do have children from a prior marriage, and what you've done as a couple is maybe take 20,000 from his funds and 20,000 from her funds to make a down payment on a home. And really what you're wanting to do is to see, well, if something happened to me, I want my husband to have this home. So what you could do is you've got your share as a tenant in common, and you can determine, do I want that share to go to him, or do I want that share to go to my two kids, or gee, do I want that share to be in a life estate for that individual? Okay, so it gets down to that business of what are we trying to accomplish with this tenancy in common. And married couples without kids could still have a tenancy in common, because if they were, again, combining resources, they still might want to have some of that resource to go to their parents. Maybe their parents need some extra care. And I wanted that for my parents at one point. If something happened to me, I wanted to make sure that they were well taken care of. So any property I had as a tenant in common could be then sold, in this case to my husband, and that money would be available there for my folks.
Okay. Another question, are there any legal ramifications to leaving a deceased name on a bank account? For my in-laws, for example, one passed and the other is still living, and there are lots of direct deposit accounts such as Social Security that would be difficult to transfer to a new account.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying with something like that. And is there any harm in doing that? It's particularly with a checking account. And I guess I would say this would be a good one to ask your attorney about for specifics. But from my experience, if the bank is not making you close it out, and mom needs that comfort that it's that account, then it's worth doing that. Just maybe keep an eye on the account to make sure somebody doesn't steal his identity, even, since the husband typically dies first. And just keep an eye on the account. And a lot of institutions now have the ability for you to be online and check it out just now and then. And that might be something that would be helpful to mom as well.
Okay, another question. Is joint tenancy typically the default on things like property, like real estate and checking accounts. Like if I just sign what they give me, is it going to be joint tenancy?
Yeah, and see, you may not even realize, but you're making a choice. When you buy some property, they will ask you how you want it titled. And if you don't specifically tell them, they'll just assume that joint tenancy. So it's something that you need to be aware of. You don't have a joint tenancy just because you get married. You don't have a joint tenancy just because you have two people. For example, let's say Emily and I were sisters and we had inherited property from our parents. Well, maybe what we would want to do is not a joint tenancy, because I die, she gets it all. Well, I might want to have it as two sisters as the tenant in common so that I could leave my share to whomever I want to. So it's thinking through that process. What's the next step? And why do I want to have it joint tenancy versus tenancy in common? And that's another Mont guide that I've got that's just on property ownership. And it takes you through some of that decision making and things to think about before you do it. And once you've got it done, it doesn't mean you can't change it. You can change it as long as both in real property, as long as the two people agree, because you need to have the signature of the second person if we're going to change the title.
Okay. So if we do want to change the title, what's the first step?
Okay, the first step is both of you have that conversation, that you're understanding why you're wanting to change it and what you're wanting to change it to, and what would the benefits be of that. You know, well, hey, tenancy in common, our will can control both parts. Joint tenancy, it doesn't. And gee, it makes a difference which one of us lasts the longest. I mean, my goodness, at one of my young ag couples conferences, I had a young man in there that says, well, what about this right to life business? What about you pull the plug and wait till the 8th day to do it? And I go, that's evil. We don't even want to go there. But I'm sure we're going to see a court case on that sometime. So the first stage is having that conversation. And then there are various forms available on the web. I would probably feel a little more comfortable having an attorney, a real estate attorney, do it, and hope that he or she will explain those consequences as well. Because remember, a will's going to control some of it, but not joint tenancy until all joint tenants are deceased.
Okay. I don't see any more questions as of right now, except for some asking whether these are recorded. Yes, they are. I will put in the chat where you can find more information about these webinars. The first link I'm sharing now is the webinar schedule. I had somebody ask if the link to each week's presentation is different. Yes, it is. It's just kind of a hiccup we had to deal with this type of WebEx program. But if you go to that website that I put in the chat, each week the new link will be posted so you can find it there. And then there's also a page that has past recordings and different resources like the Mont guides that Marsha's talking about, and I'm sharing that right now. So you can go to both of those links. And again, if you gave us your email address in that evaluation poll, we have it and we can put you on the list as well.
And then we'll send you a reminder on Monday mornings.
Yes.
Our third person that's helping with these is Carrie, and she is the one that takes care of making sure that you all get notified about the upcoming one that we'll have next week. And that's the one on wills.
Yeah, so the other thing too is if you know somebody who hasn't been able to tune into the webinars, but they'd like to start getting those reminders and registering from now on, if you go to that Tuesday Tips website, both Marsha and I's emails are there. And so you can always send us an email, have them send us an email saying, please add me to the list, and we can do that easily.
And I'd like to say hi to the 88-year-old who said she was having a terrible time trying to get on our programs. So she emailed back again. We tried to help. And she said what she's decided to do is just go to the YouTube. And I'm embarrassed. I didn't know that we had the YouTubes, Emily. And you just click on it and it starts. And that way you don't have to do all these other things. And so I thank that person for educating me as well.
Okay, somebody else asked if I sign up for reminders in a previous session, do I need to sign up again? No, you do not. we have you on the email list, so you should be getting those. If for some reason you signed up and you're not getting them, feel free to email us and let us know. But as far as I know, they've been working pretty well. So
Yeah. And also, just want to let you know if there's other topics that you would like to see that we don't have up there, I'd be glad to talk about probate, personal representative. I mean, there's a whole host of things. And we just kind of started with this, seeing if there would be enough interest, first of all, across the state. And I can't travel yet. And so this is a great way to be able to reach folks that have questions and try to provide you with that information. I think of Emily and I as your taxpayer dollars at work. So I hope you feel like you're getting your money's worth.
okay. I haven't seen any more questions come up, so I suppose if that's it, we can wrap.
Shut her down. Okay. Well, again, thanks for your participation, and I look forward to seeing you next week.
Thanks, everybody.